Why do Democrats hate Americans so much? When Hillary was running for president, she said half of Donald Trump's supporters were, quote, a basket of deplorables. Recently, Joe Biden, at a speech in Philadelphia, told America that half of us are semi-fascist terrorists. Under the First Amendment of the Constitution, we have the right to express our opinions, and if we disagree with the left, they don't have the right to take away our freedom of speech. Clearly, the statement by Hillary and Biden are designed to silence the conservatives in America. Many Americans find it easier to go along with the left and give up their right to disagree. What would America look like today if our founding fathers would have given in to the king and not fought for their freedom? Today we must fight to take America back. Join the new generation of patriots who believe in the Constitution. Join the new revolution in America. Fire your shot for freedom. It's time for Black and White, a show that wants to bring all of us together, talking again about the issues that concern us. It's time to hear from people who only want to deal with facts. It's time for you to re-engage in your right of American free speech. It's time for Black and White. Welcome back to Blacks and Whites, and we have a very fascinating woman to join us today who's going to talk about an amazing book. She's going to show us the cover. Hold it up. The Weaponization of Loneliness, with the subtitle, How Tyrants Stroke Our Fear of Isolation to Silence, Divide, and Conquer Us. Stella Morabito, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan.
We had an opportunity to spend a little time before the show talking about the book and what she's talking about. So I want to start off by, why don't you tell us, our listeners, a little bit about your background and who you are?
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I've always been fascinated by how propaganda and psychological manipulation operates. And so my professional background includes a master's degree in Russian and Soviet history. And then I went on to work at the CIA, and this was some years ago. But I worked primarily as an analyst of propaganda and media analysis of the Soviet Union. And of course, if anybody is familiar with the history of the Soviet Union and Stalin's reign of terror, the weaponization of loneliness or isolation really plays into that when you look at the history. And then I never stopped my fascination, even when I stayed home to raise my family and homeschool. I was always fascinated by these dynamics and studied I was always collecting clippings of what was going on with all of the issues and the woke creep. I even saw transgender propaganda in my public library in the mid 1990s. So I had my eye out for a lot of these things for a long time. And then I started writing op-eds, starting with the Washington Examiner. And then I'm currently, since 2014, a senior contributor to the Federalist, where I write about a lot of these kinds of issues.
So first question I want to ask you, was the explosion, let me try it a different way. Was it an explosion stimulated by the pandemic that saw this tremendous weaponization of everything? Or was it just the way it evolved?
Oh no, I think that you could see lots of headlines for a lot of years going back before the pandemic of a loneliness epidemic in this country. And I think part of it had to do with the explosion of technological community, the internet and social media and all of this that kind of pulled people inward. And then along with that, there's so many different factors that affected that. I mean, family breakdown, community breakdown, but also what was happening in education, and kids just weren't learning. They weren't getting content knowledge they needed. So in my view, it was like a cultivation of ignorance. All of these things are isolating. And then we had the opioid epidemic and all that. But what happened with COVID is that it just really fast-tracked a sense of isolation. And we were blatantly and literally isolated from one another. And you could even feel the cultivation of hostilities going on as they, promoted this propaganda about, the vaccine mandates, that at first they said that wasn't ever going to happen. Of course it did. And, people are getting fired from their jobs for not being vaccinated. Well, it's not really a vaccine if you need to be boosted forever. But it's all of these things played into hostilities that hit at the very heart of our private lives, families, angry with one another, angry with those who were unvaccinated, wouldn't let them come to Thanksgiving dinner. And, all of this fear mongering through through this pandemic really brought out what I consider to be into the open the war on private life. And I think that that's something that has gone on for a long time with all these utopian radical revolutions throughout history. You can look at the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, Nazi Germany. You can look at, Mao's Cultural Revolution, and every single one of those had, loyalty had to be to the mass state and not to your personal family, faith community, friendships. So, you could see the erosion there. It's really troubling, and we have to turn around. We can't keep going down this path. Very dangerous.
Hold up the cover of your book again for me, please.
Yes, I should see if I can put it. Maybe I'll just hold it here.
Okay, that's all right. The question
Yeah.
I want to continue the discussion, but I want to go to the cover of the book. Why do you think you and the publishers decided to put Dr. Fauci on the cover?
Well, I think he pretty much sums up or symbolizes the feelings a lot of people have connected with the weaponization of loneliness based on all of these mandates that were shoved down our throats during the COVID regime, which, I personally don't think is going to end. It is going to come back in another form. But he pretty much is the symbol of that. And you see him there wagging his finger at us. So I actually thought it was a pretty good cover for political nonfiction.
Right. So you can put it down. It's just,
Yeah.
rest your arm in your hands. How is it that do you have any sense of how was it he was able to gain so much power so quickly?
Oh, that's a question probably more for insiders, but my view is that, he was set up as an expert for a long time. I mean, what has it been, 40, 50 years? So everybody kind of looked at him. I don't know how, through, what channels he got all of his supposed gravitas, but, I think President Trump trusted him. With the institution of medicine, Americans really do want to trust it. And so when you have somebody who's been there for decades, they listen. I think a lot of that trust has eroded. A lot of that trust is gone.
I agree with you.
Yeah. So, but I think traditionally in America, we want to trust our doctors. Who doesn't want to trust their doctor? And so, and then again, that's another manipulative kind of thing. You get somebody who you're supposed to trust, and then they start, using what's called undue influence, this authority figure that has the power to influence. So, that's just my take on it. It's not an insight.
I want to move to a different pew in the church, as they used to say. One of the things that I have been the most concerned about and have written reams of commentary on is the impact of what we did in terms of policies, the impact on our children and the education system.
Yeah.
And I think loneliness is a huge negative when we went to isolating children, taking them out of the classroom, trying to put them in front of a TV, which didn't work. And we have a generation, or perhaps two, that have been so adversely affected,
Mhm.
I fully expect to see increasing suicide rates coming
Oh, yeah.
on, and more violence, because the isolation of the children as they were evolving, it creates a situation of antisocial behavior. What do you think?
Oh, yeah. No, it's really criminal what this has done to our children. But it's been going on for a long time. But the COVID isolation of children was just, in my view, totally unforgivable. I mean, we knew the children were not that affected by it, and the survival rate for anybody who didn't have other, major serious health issues was almost 100%. So there's something totally totally awry here. But children in particular, they're very highly suggestible. I mean, we all are, but children in particular, they really, we're all hardwired to connect with other people. And you can, that's magnified so many times for children, and their healthy development, really depends on healthy relationships and stability. And so when you have not just these COVID practices, these covering, they have to cover their faces, they can't talk to each other at lunch, and they've got 2 years now, they're set back academically, but I believe emotionally and mentally in so many ways as well. But at the same time, you have these really, really, I feel, cruel curricula, like the critical race theory that tells them to really, I mean, I don't know how else to put it. It really tells them to hate each other, to have hostilities against each other based on their demographic, what they look like, and then there's that's the whole victim oppressor thing going on. But then the whole gender ideology thing, and that's been brewing up for a long time. Like I told you, I've detected it in my public library. It was a small thing, but in the mid 90s. And so this has been going on for a long time. I was starting to write about the transgender thing about 12 years ago. But uh the that is so destabilizing for children. I mean, about how girls in particular now are identifying as boys by this rapid rate. And in my view, there's a lot of reasons for that, but primarily I think it's to break out of the isolation. There's a lot of bullying in public schools, and so they become a protected class that way. And also everybody gives them a big pat on the back. You're so brave. You're so, it all fits into the whole cultural, push that the educrats, are pushing for with this curriculum. So I know I got a little bit away from your question about how COVID affected children, but I think it fast tracked a lot of that isolation that they were already feeling. I talk about the public schools in one of the chapters, about institutional subversion, and how so much of what goes on there, they're not, you can be isolated in more than one way. I mean, you can be isolated physically, but you could also, if you're cut off from information, from content knowledge, which is what's happening, in the schools, everything is just this indoctrination. That's very isolating as well. And you always feel like you have to say the right thing, or you're going to be ostracized, and you're actually taught to ostracize. I hate to say it, but teachers actually do. Some of these teachers will actually teach kids to ostracize others on the basis of being uh, you know a bigot if you don't accept you know the orthodoxy of gender ideology. Anyway, that's kind of a rambling way of answering your question. But for children, suicide rates are spiking, anxiety, depression, all of this. And the lockdowns, especially for schools, didn't help.
Well, we have to take a quick break here, and we'll be right back and continue our conversation on a very important subject. So we'll be right back. Inflation for most people is causing them to use their credit cards to try and make up for income shortfalls. How big is this problem? In the second quarter of 2022, Americans added $46 billion to their credit card balances. Some of that could be you. The Federal Reserve Consumer Credit Report showed that the rate of interest on credit cards went from 14.56 to 16.65%. Those Americans struggling with credit card debt saw their delinquency rates escalate from 1.66% to 1.81%. The Cambridge Debt Consolidation Program may be able to help you reduce the interest rates by 2/3 and cut your time to pay off the debt from 30 years to as little as 5 years. If you're struggling and you want professional and objective help getting your credit house in order, then call 1-855-435-2066 or go to the website cambridgeyescredit.org/BW-podcast and get your house in order. Welcome back, and we're having a fascinating conversation. Put up the book. Let's see the cover. Here we go. Weaponization of Loneliness: How Tyrants Stoke Our Fear of Isolation to Silence, Divide, and Conquer. Thank you. I want to go back to something you said in our first segment. You took your children out of school and decided to homeschool them. Why?
Oh my goodness. And I was in a so-called blue ribbon district, school district, very highly, supposedly highly desired. This was a while ago. This was before a lot of the really, really crazy stuff, but still, I didn't feel they were getting the academic, I didn't feel they were getting what they needed. And I'll tell you, one of the other things that I did while they were still in school was, and I'm talking about a fourth grader and a sixth grader at the time, is I had myself credentialed as a substitute teacher in that district. I never went into my children's elementary school, but I went into about 5 or 6 of the other elementary schools around them. This is in Montgomery County, Maryland, and it was one of the, top, fed into the top high schools there. And, I would go to these elementary schools and do my substitute teaching. And I had the same lesson plan that the teacher was going to do that day. And just in terms of the regimentation, it's not like I wasn't totally familiar with this, but as a substitute teacher, I was observing, and some of the kids were just wonderful. Some of them were awful, but I was observing how many interruptions and a lot of the tensions with the kids, and a lot of the cliquishness and all that, especially sixth graders, and so I by the end of the day, and I did this a few dozen times, I was mostly, in my view, it was an experiment. I mean, it's not a small deal. You have to get yourself fingerprinted and do all this other stuff to become a substitute teacher, but I didn't have the confidence at the time in homeschooling. But by the end of it, I said to myself, I could teach my kids more in 5 minutes that went on all day long today. And I started saying that to myself over and over. I couldn't believe it, but it was true, literally true. And this was considered one of the top school districts. So that was one reason, was I felt that they weren't getting what they needed. There were all these trendy little things, that weren't really history, these little, I don't know, trendy ideas of, you go off and pretend you make you make some item of clothing or something for, to represent, say Greek history or, Roman. It wasn't really history. So there was that, and they just weren't getting the support. One of them in particular weren't getting the support he needed. So I just did it on my own, and they took off. Now I was lucky that I had I had a husband who had a fantastic job, and I didn't have to worry about a lot of the other things that people who a lot of women would feel they needed to work or or something else. So anyway, I was lucky, but that was one reason. And of course, the other one, the emotional environment, in my view, is toxic. especially in the big public schools. I've written about this before in the Federalist, just the whole kind of, especially high schools, this whole Blade Runner sort of environment, Blade Runner, I mean, the schools themselves are isolating, kind of alienating environments. So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but I felt
Sure.
that there is a kind of an isolating aspect, a very strong one in these public schools.
Right. So I believe that the problems that we have in the public school today has its roots in 1946. And I say that because I believe when the husbands went to war, the wives got a job to have the family survive. And when the husband came back from war and saw that his wife was working and making money, they made a decision that they could do things with two incomes that they couldn't do with just one income. They could have a bigger house in the suburbs, another car, take vacations, on and on and on. So when it came to education, the parents, in many degrees, abdicated the responsibility for the type of education their children receive to the school classroom teacher. And it's at that moment in time that the left of that position, teachers, began to change the curriculum and the role of the teacher and the child in the classroom. And it's evolved to where we are today. There are very powerful unions, and they are dealing with critical race theory and gender identification and all of this. And yet, most of what's going on that's controversial, as you aptly pointed out, doesn't belong in the school system anyway, because we're not teaching fundamental skills.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, no, if you want me to comment on, that changing role in the family and the wife and working, I don't know the extent to which I, have a background in that and how
Okay.
that would have affected things. But certainly I would agree that the schools, at a certain point became just sort of an expectation of a place for the kids to go while we did this and that and the other thing. And people just kind of got used to having that and lost track of the the essential values. Especially this is happening while the family is breaking down. You've got no fault divorce getting started, and even before that, I think there was a romanticization of divorce in the movies, and this especially started in the 50s, 60s. So there was this kind of breakdown, family breakdown, and out of wedlock marriage and so on, where the child, nobody cares about the children, it seems. I mean, they're being, they're they're the ones who are stuck holding the bag, when it comes to divorce and isolation and all of these, all these other factors, abortion, it's and the push to destabilize them really through gender ideology. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. I mean, they do it under the guise of anti-discrimination and so on and so forth, but it's a very destabilizing. If you can't see how that destabilizes a child, I mean, when my kids were toddlers, they used to watch this Mr. Rogers, and Mr. Rogers had a little song about only boys can be the daddies, only girls can be the mommies. And of course, it's just really amazing how far things have come, even when my kids were little. Now they're, oh my goodness. I mean, even though Mr. Rogers is considered some kind of a, among child development experts, great guy, he's dead now, but I don't know what he'd have to say about all this drag queen stuff. I think he'd be horrified. But I mention that only because it shows how quickly these things have taken off. and how quickly things have turned around upside down and are very destabilizing. I mean, he sang that song as a means of helping kids come to terms with reality. I mean, his show was all about the line between fantasy and reality, imagination. Now we're going to go to the land of make believe, and it even showed the switch where the little trolley came in and all of that. And then what this is real, the community, and all of that. So anyway, things started changing, yes, post-war. But they also, through critical theory itself, the Frankfurt School, I don't know how many of your listeners are familiar with that, but the cultural Marxists got started 100 years ago, with this whole long march through the institutions that it's manifesting itself today.
I wonder if you would speak to, in the time we have left, is it possible to change?
Oh, yeah, I think.
And if so, how?
Yeah. Well, I think one reason I wrote the book is because this dynamic, okay, and I don't think I talked enough about that, this dynamic that, we're social creatures. Of course, we all know that instinctively, but we have this hardwired need to connect with others. The flip side being the fear of being isolated. We need to become a whole lot more conscious of how that is exploited, that vulnerability that's natural, very natural in all of us, is exploited to bring about our self-censorship, which, turns into top-down censorship when we give bad agendas that much oxygen. So I wrote the book to help people learn, I hope, kind of a blueprint for how these things happen, how they've happened throughout history. I talk about the conformity impulse, Solomon Asch's experiment about the conformity impulse in the 1950s, and, followed by his student Stanley Milgram's experiments, the shock experiments, how people can be, gently coerced into hurting other people through the just following orders, obedience to authority. And, it goes on through that and the institutional corruption that we're seeing, and to try to put together a blueprint and understanding of how these dynamics, these patterns have played out through history and how they continue to play out through the, the globalist agenda. And yes, we're kind of in the fourth quarter now, but I think, yes, we can turn it around if we become aware and if we understand how critical our private life, our private sphere of life is. That's really the big prize with totalitarians. It always has been. Just look at Mao's struggle sessions, or the Bolsheviks, teaching kids to turn in their parents for, a misstep or saying something that's politically incorrect. It's a pattern. We don't want it to get to that point, but the private sphere of life is where our power really lies, because propaganda, mass propaganda, is not as convincing as a one-on-one conversation with someone you trust, a friend, family member, or whatever. And we have to keep building and cultivating that private sphere. We have to reach out, know who your neighbors are, get to know people, have them see you and you see them as unique individuals, not some identity politics manufactured demographic who's an oppressor or a victim. And the more we can do that in our communities, in our families, it's a long road. I'm not saying, it's an overnight thing, but we've got to start that work.
That's terrific. We have been having a wonderful conversation with Stella Morabito. Did I get that right?
Yes, you did.
Thank you. How can the people buy the book?
Well, it's available right now on Amazon, just online. It's on Amazon and on Barnes and Noble. There's also a Kindle edition available on Amazon. That's, you just have to order it through there, and it'll get to you pretty quick.
Thank you for joining us today.
So thank you very much for having me, Dan. I really
You're welcome.
enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you. We'll be right back. Okay. So I think you would make a wonderful guest on our Moms Across America show. And if you would like to make a note to go to Blacks, BLACKS, and Whites, WHITES.US.
Mhm.
And in the upper header, there's shows. Scroll down to Moms Across America and listen to some of the episodes, and watch them. Just a couple, and let me know if you'd be interested in joining the ladies in the conversation.
Oh, yeah, I know. I can tell you right now, I probably would, because as a suburban mom myself, not today, but back in those days, I understood the pressures. I mean, suburban mothers in particular have a really hard time, when they're dealing with this whole environment of political correctness. They're worried that their children are going to be ostracized.
Yeah.
And women, as you know, the Obama campaign in 2012 showed us, they used that Life of Julia infographic.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, it was, we're not on air, right?
No.
Oh, okay, yeah, and so they have targeted women as the biggest voter bloc, and in fact, this last midterms, I don't know if you saw the polling, but it was like 37 unmarried women by a margin of 37% voted Democrat, 37%. So it just kind of indicates, unmarried men, it was interesting. It was something like they were like 8%, by a margin of 8% more Republican. That was unmarried men. But unmarried women is this vast voter bloc that Democrats have, abused. Married men, married women voted Republican. Being married puts you in the mindset of, looking towards the future of your children, looking towards the future and trying to preserve the things that matter. And, I guess the unmarried, I'm just speculating, but, it's more concern about who's going to take care of me, especially when it comes to women. That's that whole Life of Julia infographic, taking care of her from cradle to grave. It was really unbelievable, but that's kind of where we are.
So thank you for your time. I'll be in touch about Moms Across America.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you. I hope I
Now,
didn't
I will
just.
send you a copy of the show when it's done. Maybe you can put it
thank
up on
you.
your link to your website.
Okay, thank you very much. I
My
really
pleasure.
appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.